Before the first shot was fired, there was only the sound of the sea. Cold, gray, indifferent, the Atlantic moved against the Norman coast the way it always had, the way it would long after every man standing in those concrete towers had turned to memory. The German sentries at their posts in the pre-dawn dark of June 6, 1944, looked out at a fog-thick horizon and saw nothing, heard nothing beyond the eternal conversation between wind and water. Some of them had been stationed here for months, some for years, and in that time the wall at their backs had grown so massive, so layered, so seemingly absolute in its permanence, that the idea of what was coming had begun to feel like myth, something theoretical, something that would always be coming and would therefore never quite arrive. They were looking in the right direction. They were simply looking too late.
Adolf Hitler called it the Atlantic Wall, and the name was chosen with the instinct of a man who understood the power of language to shape reality. A wall implies impregnability. A wall implies that what is on one side will remain on one side permanently by the brute physical logic of mass and thickness and depth. From the northern tip of Norway to the Spanish border, stretching nearly 3,000 miles of European coastline, the Third Reich had poured its engineering ambition into concrete and steel on a scale that the ancient world would have recognized as the architecture of gods who did not believe in losing. The numbers alone are staggering in a way that almost loses meaning. 17 million cubic meters of concrete, more than 1 million metric tons of steel, 15,000 individual fortifications. The organization Todt, the vast construction apparatus of the Reich, had consumed the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of workers across occupied Europe to raise this monument to defensive thinking. Tobruk pits sunk into the earth, their circular concrete collars holding machine gun nests and mortar teams at ground level, nearly invisible from the water and nearly impossible to suppress without a direct hit. Massive gun casements, reinforced concrete chambers housing artillery pieces behind walls thick enough to absorb direct bombardment and return fire without interruption. Range-finding towers, observation posts, communication bunkers buried so deep they could operate through everything short of a direct hit from a ship's main battery. And then, below the cliff lines and across the sand itself, the Devil's Gardens. Rommel had ordered them. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man assigned to make the Atlantic Wall actually work in the event of the invasion he knew was coming, had walked these beaches and understood something that the concrete alone could not solve. The beaches had to be made into killing grounds before the first Allied soldier ever cleared the water. Steel stakes driven into the sand at low tide, angled to gut the hulls of landing craft before they could disgorge their men. Belgian gates, massive iron obstacles rusting in the surf. Teller mines fixed to wooden poles waiting at the waterline. Ramps fitted with explosive devices. Hedgehogs of crossed steel beams designed to rip open anything that tried to pass over them. The beaches of Normandy in the gray pre-dawn of June 6th looked less like a coastline and more like the floor of an abattoir waiting for the shift to begin. Rommel had said it plainly. The first 24 hours would decide everything. He was nearly right. Inside the Higgins boats, men were discovering the precise texture of terror. The LCVPs, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, were flat-bottomed, shallow-drafted steel boxes designed to cross open water and deposit soldiers on hostile shores with maximum efficiency and minimum comfort. They accomplished the first and third objectives with mechanical indifference. The second was a different matter entirely. The English Channel on the morning of June 6th was running heavy, 3 to 4 foot swells pushing the small craft sideways and dropping them into troughs that sent cold green water cascading over the gunnels and across the huddled men inside. The smell was diesel fuel and salt water, and the particular sourness of men who had been seasick for hours in an enclosed space with no horizon to fix on and no way to prepare for what was waiting at the end of the crossing. Men prayed, men vomited, men sat with their rifles held against their chests and stared at the gray steel of the ramp in front of them and tried to think about nothing at all, because thinking about anything in particular led by the most directive routes to the understanding of what those ramps were about to reveal. The vibration of the engines was a physical thing, moving through the hull and into the feet and the spine and the chest, a constant mechanical thrumming that was the last familiar sensation many of them would ever feel. Some of them had been soldiers for 3 years. Some of them were teenagers who had enlisted the previous autumn. All of them, in those final minutes, were reduced to the same essential human condition: cold, wet, frightened, and moving forward anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable, and because the men on either side of them were doing the same, and because that, finally, at the deepest level, is what armies actually run on. The beach appeared through the fog. The concrete throat of the bunkers waited. The ramps dropped. What happened in the first 20 minutes on Omaha Beach cannot be fully communicated by any arrangement of words. It can only be approached, circled, described from the edges, because its center is something that language was not built to contain. The MG-42 was the defining instrument of that morning. The German machine gun fired at a cyclic rate of up to 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous mechanical shriek that soldiers described as a zipper being pulled closed across the sky. 2 MG-42 positions, properly sited in concrete reinforced emplacements with interlocking fields of fire, could sweep a beach with enough lead per second to make survival on open ground a matter of pure statistical luck. At Omaha, there were not 2, there were dozens, positioned on the bluffs above the beach, angled to fire along the length of the sand rather than straight out to sea, creating crossing arcs of fire that meant there was no angle of approach that was clean, no patch of ground that was safe, no moment of disembarkation that was anything other than immediately and lethally dangerous. The DD tanks, the duplex drive Shermans, fitted with canvas screens and propellers to swim ashore ahead of the infantry, were supposed to provide the suppressing fire that would allow men to get across the sand and reach the seawall at the base of the bluffs. Of the 32 DD tanks launched into the channel off Omaha, 27 sank before they reached the shore. The waves tore the canvas flotation screens. The propellers churned uselessly against swells that the engineers who designed them had not fully accounted for. 60 tons of steel and 4-man crews went to the bottom of the channel, and the men coming behind them had nothing between themselves and the concrete bunkers but 200 yards of open sand. The water at the edge of the beach ran red, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally, physically, chemically red, because enough men had been hit in enough volume to discolor the surf, and the waves pushed that color up the sand and back again with the same mechanical regularity they always had, indifferent to what they were carrying, following the physics of tide and moon and wind exactly as they had for 1,000 years before this morning and would for 1,000 after it. The noise was beyond description, beyond the human auditory scale of anything that deserves to be called noise. It was a physical environment, the continuous percussion of heavy artillery, the flat crack of rifle fire, the tearing mechanical shriek of the machine guns, the explosions of mortar rounds walking up and down the waterline, the sounds of men underneath it all,
which were the worst sounds of all. This was the Atlantic Wall doing what it had been built to do. And then, slowly, something changed. It did not come from the generals. It did not come from any tactical revision issued from a command ship offshore, or from any grand strategic insight that turned the tide of the morning. It came from the beach itself, from individual men in small groups, sometimes just 2 or 3 together, who reached the same conclusion through the cold logic of survival. The beach was death, and the only direction that was not the beach was forward and up. A sergeant named Slaughter, a ranger named Rudder, hundreds of men whose names the history books never recorded, who looked up at the bluffs above them and began to climb, under fire, through barbed wire, across minefields, using the bodies of the men ahead of them as cover when there was nothing else, pulling themselves upward by pure will in the face of everything the concrete above them could deliver. The German positions on the bluffs had been designed against a frontal assault from the water. They had not been fully designed against men appearing beneath them, in their blind spots, working their way upward through the draws and gullies that creased the cliff face. Grenades went in through apertures, Bangalores blew the wire, flamethrowers reached into concrete rooms and solved their arguments with fire. Casement by casement, Tobruk by Tobruk, the Atlantic Wall on the bluffs above Omaha was taken apart not by the overwhelming weight of Allied industrial power, but by frightened men who had run out of alternatives and found in that extremity something that concrete had never been designed to stop. By evening, the beach was held, the bluffs were taken, the wall had not fallen, it stood where it had always stood, its concrete unbroken in most places, its steel intact, its engineering as sound as the day it was finished.
But the men inside it were dead or retreating, and the tide coming in behind the Allies was not water, but men and machines, and the irreversible momentum of a campaign that would not stop until it reached Berlin. The silence that returned to Omaha Beach on the evening of June 6, 1944, was a different silence from the one that had preceded the morning. It was heavier. It carried things that silence does not normally carry. The Atlantic Wall stood on the bluffs above the sand, still massive, still gray, still radiating the cold authority of engineered permanence. But it was hollow now, a monument without a purpose, a symbol of an ideology that had poured its faith into concrete and discovered, at the cost of everything, that concrete is only as strong as the idea it is built to defend. The wall had not been broken by superior firepower alone. It had not been broken by tactical genius or technological advantage, though both had played their parts. It had been broken by the oldest force in the history of human conflict, the force that has brought down every wall that has ever been built, from Jericho to Berlin. The force that no engineer has ever successfully accounted for in any load-bearing calculation, because it does not obey the physics of mass or the chemistry of reinforced concrete. It had been broken by men who refused to stop. Every wall ever built carries within its foundation the assumption that what stands against it will eventually yield. Every fortress ever raised by human hands rests on the belief that ambition can be made permanent by making it heavy enough. The Atlantic Wall was the supreme expression of that belief, the largest defensive construction in history, built by the most mechanically sophisticated nation of its age, designed by men who understood engineering the way other men understand faith. And on a cold, gray morning in June, it was not enough. The concrete is still there. You can walk along those bluffs today and press your hand against it, cold and rough and permanent feeling, moss growing in the shell craters, the gun slits still facing out toward a sea that no longer carries any threat. It asks no questions. It offers no answers. It simply stands, the way ruins always stand, as evidence that something was built here and something came,
and the thing that came was not stopped. Some walls, in the end, exist only to show us what we are capable of walking through.